The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the mess hall at Nellie's Air Force Base, casting harsh shadows across the faces of 5 young recruits huddled around their table. Their laughter echoed off the institutional walls as they watched a small woman in civilian clothes navigate the serving line with careful, measured steps. She wore a faded denim jacket over worn jeans, her graying hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. To them, she looked like someone's grandmother who'd gotten lost. "Look at that," whispered Airman First Class Rodriguez, barely containing his snickers. "Someone let their mom wander onto base." His companions erupted in muffled laughter, their youth and arrogance making them feel invincible in their crisp uniforms. The woman's weathered hands trembled slightly as she reached for a tray. The tremor was subtle, barely noticeable unless you knew what to look for. But these recruits saw weakness where others might see the accumulated weight of years spent in service to something greater than themselves. "Bet she's looking for the commissary," added Airman Mitchell, his voice dripping with condescension. "Probably can't even read the signs." The group's mockery continued, their voices growing bolder as they mistook the woman's quiet demeanor for timidity. What they couldn't see, what their inexperience prevented them from recognizing, was the way she carried herself. Despite her civilian clothes, despite her unassuming appearance, there was something in her posture that spoke of discipline forged in fire. Her eyes, pale blue and distant, held depths they couldn't fathom. When she moved, it was with an economy of motion that suggested years of training, of muscle memory honed by repetition and necessity. The mess hall buzzed with its usual chaos, trays clattering, conversations overlapping, the constant hum of military life in motion. But for those who knew how to look, there were signs everywhere. The respectful nods from older enlisted personnel. The way Master Sergeant Williams behind the serving line straightened almost imperceptibly when she approached. The reverent silence that seemed to follow in her wake, unnoticed by the oblivious recruits. She selected her meal with the same careful attention she'd once given to pre-flight checks, each choice deliberate and purposeful. When she turned to find a seat, her gaze swept across the room with the trained eye of someone who'd spent decades assessing threats, calculating odds, and reading situations that could mean the difference between life and death. The recruits' laughter grew louder, more cruel. They were about to learn that appearances could be devastatingly deceiving, and that some people carry their history not as a burden, but as a badge of honor invisible to those who lack the wisdom to see it. Outside, the Nevada sun beat down mercilessly on the tarmac where F-22 Raptors sat in perfect formation, their sleek frames gleaming like silver daggers against the desert landscape. The sight would have meant something to her, everything, in fact. But inside the mess hall, surrounded by the ignorant mockery of children who'd never seen real combat, she simply looked like another forgotten relic of a bygone era. The woman found an empty table near the window, her movements deliberate and unhurried. As she sat down, placing her tray with the same precision she'd once used to set down million-dollar aircraft, the recruits' commentary grew more animated. They were performing now, each trying to outdo the others in their juvenile cruelty. "Think she even knows what those planes outside are?" Rodriguez gestured toward the window where the imposing silhouettes of military aircraft dotted the flight line. His question triggered another wave of snickering from his companions, their heads bobbing with self-satisfied amusement. Airman Thompson, barely 19 and still soft around the edges despite weeks of basic training, leaned forward conspiratorially. "Money says she thinks they're for air shows. Probably never seen a real fighter jet up close." The irony of his statement would have been palpable to anyone with knowledge of the woman's true identity, but these young men were blissfully unaware of the legend sitting just 30 feet away. The woman began eating methodically, her fork moving with the same measured precision that characterized everything she did. She seemed oblivious to their commentary, lost in thoughts that carried her far from this sterile cafeteria to places these recruits couldn't imagine, to cockpits where split-second decisions meant survival, to missions where failure wasn't just unacceptable but fatal. Master Sergeant Williams approached her table, his weathered face breaking into a subtle smile of recognition. He carried himself with the bearing of someone who'd served long enough to distinguish between those who talked about service and those who'd lived it. As he neared her table, the recruit's attention shifted, sensing an interaction that might provide fresh material for their entertainment. "Ma'am," Williams said quietly, his voice carrying a respect that seemed disproportionate to the recruit's eyes. "How's the civilian life treating you?" His question carried weight, layers of meaning that spoke to shared experiences and mutual understanding. She looked up from her meal, those pale blue eyes focusing with laser intensity. When she spoke, her voice was soft but carried an underlying strength that suggested depths unexplored. "Different pace, Sergeant. Takes some adjusting." Her words were economical, precise, the language of someone accustomed to communication where every syllable mattered. The recruits exchanged glances, their curiosity piqued by the interaction. Rodriguez nudged Mitchell, both sensing an opportunity to elevate their performance. "Look at that," Rodriguez whispered, not bothering to lower his voice. "Even the old-timers are being polite to Grandma, probably feel sorry for her." Williams' jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, his years of military discipline warring with his desire to educate these ignorant young men. Instead, he maintained his respectful demeanor, understanding that some lessons were best learned through experience rather than lecture. The afternoon sun shifted, casting longer shadows across the mess hall floor, and somewhere in the distance, the sound of jet engines beginning their pre-flight sequences created a subtle rumble that seemed to resonate in the woman's bones. She straightened slightly, an unconscious response to a sound that had once been the soundtrack to her life. Colonel Harrison entered the mess hall with the commanding presence that 25 years of military service had burned into his very DNA. His uniform was immaculate, his bearing unmistakable, and his reputation preceded him like a force of nature. Every conversation in the vicinity died to respectful murmurs as he made his way through the space, nodding acknowledgments to personnel who snapped to attention with varying degrees of subtlety. The recruits straightened instinctively, their mockery forgotten in the presence of genuine authority. Rodriguez fumbled with his tray, suddenly conscious of his posture and the crumbs on his uniform. These were the moments that reminded them they were still children playing in an adult world, despite their military training and inflated egos. Harrison's eyes swept the room with the practiced efficiency of a leader constantly assessing his domain. When his gaze fell upon the woman at the window table, his entire demeanor shifted. The change was subtle but unmistakable, a softening around the eyes, a slight inclination of his head that spoke to recognition, and more importantly, deep respect. He altered his course, moving toward her table with purposeful strides. As he approached, Master Sergeant Williams stepped aside, his own bearing becoming more formal in the presence of both his commanding officer and the woman whose identity remained a mystery to the watching recruits. "Colonel Vega," Harrison said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet section of the mess hall. The words hung in the air like a revelation, loaded with implications that the recruits were only beginning to grasp. "I heard you might be visiting us today. Should have known you'd find your way to the mess hall. Some habits never change." The woman, Colonel Vega, smiled for the first time since entering the building. It transformed her face, revealing glimpses of the confident officer she'd once been, the leader who'd commanded respect through action rather than words. "Hello, Jack. Still trying to make pilots out of bobbies, I see." Her gentle joke carried the easy familiarity of two professionals who'd served together, fought together, and earned each other's respect through shared hardship. The recruits' table had gone silent, their earlier bravado evaporating as the reality of their situation began to crystallize. The word "colonel" reverberated through their consciousness like a physical blow, reshaping everything they thought they understood about the quiet woman they'd been mocking. Rodriguez felt his mouth go dry. Mitchell's fork clattered onto his tray. Thompson's face drained of color as the magnitude of their mistake became apparent. They'd been laughing at a colonel, not just any colonel, but someone their commanding officer clearly held in high regard. Harrison pulled out the chair across from Vega, settling into it with the ease of someone comfortable in his own authority. "How are you finding retirement? Last I heard, you were consulting for Lockheed." His question was casual, but the recruits caught the undertone of professional admiration, the suggestion that this woman's expertise remained valuable even outside active duty. "Keeps me busy," Vega replied, taking another measured bite of her meal. "Though I miss the flying. Simulators and test data aren't quite the same as feeling 30,000 pounds of thrust pushing you through the sound barrier." Her words painted pictures the recruits couldn't fully comprehend, experiences so far beyond their current understanding that they might as well have been describing magic. The silence at the recruits' table grew heavier, weighted with the dawning realization that they'd stumbled into something far beyond their comprehension. The woman they dismissed as lost and confused was discussing aircraft and military service with their commanding officer as equals, perhaps more than equals, given the deference Harrison was showing. Outside, another jet engine roared to life, the sound rolling across the base like thunder, and Colonel Vega's eyes turned toward the window with an expression of longing so profound it was almost painful to witness. Harrison followed her gaze toward the flight line where the afternoon shift was beginning their operations. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "we've got some new hotshots who could probably learn a thing or two from someone with your experience. The arrogance of youth seems to be getting worse with each class." His words carried just enough emphasis to suggest he was aware of the recruits' earlier behavior, though he didn't look in their direction. Vega's laugh was soft but knowing. "Arrogance has always been part of the job description, Jack. The trick is channeling it properly. Some of my best pilots started out as insufferable know-it-alls who thought they'd invented aviation." She paused, her eyes still fixed on the aircraft outside. "The ones who survived learned humility. The ones who didn't." She let the sentence hang, the implication clear. The recruits exchanged increasingly uncomfortable glances. Rodriguez felt sweat beginning to bead on his forehead, despite the air conditioning. The casual mention of survival rates and pilots who didn't make it served as a stark reminder of the serious nature of military aviation, something their textbooks had covered, but their experience hadn't yet made real. Thompson mustered the courage to whisper to his companions, "We need to get out of here." But moving now would only draw more attention to their table, potentially exposing their earlier behavior to Colonel Harrison's notice. They were trapped by their own poor judgment, forced to sit in uncomfortable silence while their worldview underwent rapid reconstruction. Harrison leaned back in his chair, studying Vega with the appraising look of someone considering possibilities. "You know, I've been thinking about bringing in some guest instructors for advanced tactical training. Someone with real combat experience to show these kids what actual flying looks like." His suggestion was casual, but the recruits could hear the wheels turning, could sense an opportunity being presented that they suddenly, desperately hoped wouldn't involve them directly. "I'm not sure I'm ready to be anyone's instructor these days," Vega replied, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely opposed to the idea. "My reflexes aren't what they used to be, and the technology has changed considerably since my active days." Her modesty was clearly false. The way she held herself, the confidence in her voice when discussing aviation matters, suggested someone whose skills had merely evolved rather than deteriorated. "Reflexes can be refreshed," Harrison countered, "but experience, combat awareness, the kind of instinctive understanding that keeps you alive when everything goes wrong, that's irreplaceable." He gestured toward the flight line. "These new aircraft are impressive, but they're still flown by human beings who need to make life-or-death decisions in split seconds. Technology can't replace wisdom." The conversation continued, each word adding another layer to the recruits' growing understanding of their mistake. This wasn't just a retired officer. This was someone being courted by their commanding officer for her expertise, someone whose experience was considered valuable enough to potentially shape their own training. As if sensing their discomfort, Vega's gaze shifted momentarily toward their table. Her pale blue eyes met Rodriguez's for just an instant, and in that brief connection, he saw something that made his blood run cold, not anger or disappointment, but a quiet assessment that suggested she'd been aware of their commentary all along and had simply chosen not to react. The mess hall's ambient noise seemed to fade as Colonel Harrison's radio crackled to life with the distinctive sound of air traffic control. Tower to base command. We have an unscheduled arrival requesting immediate landing clearance. Aircraft is experiencing hydraulic failure and requesting priority approach. The mechanical voice carried the urgent efficiency of professionals dealing with potential crisis. Harrison's posture shifted immediately, the relaxed conversation forgotten as his command instincts engaged. He glanced at his watch, then at the windows facing the runway. "Excuse me, Alina," he said to Vega, using her first name with the familiarity of long service together. "Duty calls." He started to rise, but paused when her hand moved almost imperceptibly toward the radio on his belt. "What type of aircraft?" Vega asked quietly, her question directed toward the radio as if she could communicate directly with the tower through Harrison's equipment. Her entire demeanor had changed, the casual retiree replaced by something sharper, more focused, a predator awakening to the scent of prey. Harrison keyed his radio. "Base command to tower, what's the aircraft type and nature of hydraulic failure?" His question carried the weight of someone who understood that different aircraft presented different challenges, different risks, different solutions. "Tower to base command, it's an F-35 Lightning, call sign Razor 7. Pilot reports complete loss of primary hydraulic system, partial loss of secondary. Aircraft is currently at 15,000 feet, approximately 12 minutes out." The tower's response sent a visible ripple through the mess hall as personnel tuned in to the unfolding situation. Vega stood smoothly, her movement so fluid and purposeful that it commanded immediate attention. The transformation was startling. Gone was any trace of the uncertain civilian the recruits had mocked, replaced by someone whose every gesture spoke of competence and authority. "Jack, that pilot is going to need talk-down assistance. F-35s with dual hydraulic failure." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone with aviation experience understood the implications. The recruits watched in growing amazement as this woman they dismissed began discussing technical specifications and emergency procedures with their commanding officer. Her knowledge wasn't theoretical. It was the hard-won expertise of someone who'd faced similar emergencies and lived to share the lessons learned. "The backup systems are reliable, but landing without primary hydraulics requires precise speed control and perfect approach angle," Vega continued, her voice taking on the crisp efficiency of a briefing officer. "If the pilot is inexperienced with emergency procedures, you're looking at a potential disaster." Harrison nodded grimly. "Our duty controller is good, but you're right, this situation requires someone who's been there." He looked at her intently. "Alina, I know you're retired, but—" "But nothing," she interrupted with quiet authority. "Where's your communications center?" The question wasn't a request for information. It was a demand for immediate action, delivered by someone accustomed to making critical decisions under pressure. As they moved toward the exit, the recruits could only watch in stunned silence as the woman they'd mocked prepared to potentially save the life of a fellow pilot. The irony was crushing. Their mockery had been directed at someone whose expertise might be the difference between life and death for one of their own. The communications center at Nellie's hummed with controlled urgency as Colonel Vega took her position at the primary radio console. Her civilian clothes looked incongruous among the uniformed personnel, but her presence commanded immediate respect from the duty officers who'd heard whispered stories of her legendary career. She adjusted her headset with practiced efficiency, her fingers finding controls she hadn't touched in months, but remembered with muscle memory precision. Razor 7, this is Nellie's ground control, call sign Nighthawk. Her voice carried the calm authority that had once guided dozens of pilots through similar emergencies. The transformation was complete. Gone was any trace of the quiet retiree, replaced by the officer who'd earned her reputation one crisis at a time. I'm reading your emergency status. Please confirm your current altitude and fuel state. The radio crackled with static before a young voice responded, tension evident despite professional training. Nighthawk, Razor 7 here. Currently at 14,000 feet, fuel state showing 22 minutes remaining at current consumption. Primary hydraulics completely offline, secondary system showing intermittent pressure. The pilot's report was textbook correct, but Vega's experienced ear caught the subtle indicators of barely controlled fear. Copy, Razor 7. What's your experience level with emergency landing procedures? Vega's question was gentle but necessary. A rookie pilot facing dual hydraulic failure needed different guidance than a veteran, and the wrong assumption could prove fatal. This is my first emergency situation, Nighthawk, came the honest reply. 6 months out of flight school, maybe 40 hours in the lightning. The admission sent a chill through the communications center. Everyone present understood the mathematics of inexperience combined with mechanical failure. Vega glanced at Harrison, who nodded his understanding. She keyed the radio again, her voice taking on a slightly warmer tone without losing its professional edge. Understood, Razor 7. I need you to listen carefully. I'm going to walk you through this step by step, and we're going to get you down safely. I've guided pilots through worse situations than this, and they're all drinking coffee in some mess hall right now, boring their friends with war stories. Her slight attempt at humor seemed to work. The pilot's next transmission carried marginally less tension. Copy, Nighthawk. Ready to receive instructions. The willingness to trust, to surrender control to someone with greater experience, marked the beginning of what Vega hoped would be a successful emergency recovery. First things first, Razor 7. I need you to reduce airspeed to 250 knots and begin a gentle descent to 10,000 feet. Nothing dramatic. Think of it as settling into a comfortable glide rather than an emergency maneuver. Vega's instructions were deliberately casual, designed to project confidence and normalcy in a situation that was anything but normal. Meanwhile, back in the mess hall, the 5 recruits remained frozen at their table, their earlier mockery now seeming not just inappropriate but actively shameful. Through the windows, they could see emergency vehicles beginning to position themselves along the runway, fire trucks, ambulances, and crash recovery equipment taking positions for what everyone hoped would be an unnecessary precaution. Rodriguez found his voice first, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. She's trying to save someone's life. The obviousness of the statement only made it more profound, highlighting the magnitude of their earlier behavior. In the communications center, Vega continued her careful guidance of the struggling aircraft. Each instruction delivered with the confidence of someone who'd faced similar situations and emerged victorious. But those watching her closely could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her free hand clenched and unclenched as she fought her own memories of cockpits filled with warning lights and the distinct sound of systems failing at the worst possible moments. Razor 7, I need you to configure for landing approach now. Landing gear down, flaps to approach position. Your aircraft is going to feel different without full hydraulic pressure, so don't be alarmed if the controls feel heavier than usual. Vega's guidance was precise, each instruction building upon the last to create a careful sequence designed to maximize the pilot's chances of survival. Nighthawk, gear is down and locked, flaps approaching position. You're right about the controls, feels like I'm wrestling with the stick. The pilot's voice carried slightly more confidence now, the result of successfully completing each requested maneuver and finding the aircraft still responding, still controllable despite its mechanical difficulties. Vega allowed herself a small smile. That's exactly how it should feel, Razor 7. Your aircraft is talking to you, telling you what it needs. Listen to it, work with it, don't fight it. You're at 6 miles out now, looking good on approach. I need you to adjust your speed to 160 knots, nice and easy. Colonel Harrison stood beside her, monitoring secondary communications and coordinating the emergency response. His respect for Vega's abilities had never been theoretical, but watching her work reinforced why her reputation had persisted long after her retirement. She possessed that rare combination of technical knowledge and intuitive understanding that separated competent pilots from legendary ones. The emergency unfolded with the methodical precision of a well-rehearsed procedure, despite being anything but routine. Each radio exchange brought Razor 7 closer to the runway, closer to safety, guided by a voice that had become his lifeline in a situation that could have easily claimed another young pilot's career or life. Outside the communications center, word of the emergency had spread throughout the base. Personnel not directly involved in the response found reasons to position themselves where they could observe the outcome. Among them, 5 recruits stood near the mess hall windows, their earlier arrogance replaced by a mixture of shame and dawning respect for the woman whose expertise was being demonstrated in the most dramatic way possible. The F-35 Lightning appeared first as a distant speck against the desert sky, growing steadily larger as it followed the precise glide path Vega had carefully constructed through her radio guidance. Even from a distance, observers could see the aircraft wasn't flying normally. Its approach seemed slightly steeper than usual, its movements more deliberate and less fluid than the graceful ballet typically performed by healthy aircraft. Razor 7, you're looking perfect on final approach, Vega's voice carried across the radio with steady reassurance. 3 miles out, altitude and speed exactly where they need to be. You're doing everything right. Her words were as much psychological support as technical guidance, understanding that confidence was as crucial as competence in emergency situations. Inside the cockpit of the struggling Lightning, the pilot's hands gripped the controls with white-knuckle intensity as he fought to maintain the approach parameters Nighthawk had specified. Every warning light on his instrument panel seemed to be illuminated, creating a Christmas display of cautions and alerts that would have overwhelmed a less trained individual. But Vega's calm voice in his headset served as an anchor point, a source of stability in the chaos of mechanical failure. Nighthawk, I'm getting some unusual vibrations through the airframe. Should I be concerned? The pilot's question betrayed his inexperience. A veteran would have known that unusual vibrations in an aircraft with hydraulic failure were expected, even normal under the circumstances. Completely normal, Razor 7, Vega responded immediately. Your aircraft is compensating for the hydraulic loss by using backup systems that don't operate as smoothly as the primary hydraulics. Think of it as your plane working harder to keep you safe. 2 miles out now, you're still looking great. The runway crew had completed their preparations, emergency equipment positioned at optimal locations along the landing strip. Foam trucks stood ready to spray fire suppression foam if needed, while crash rescue personnel occupied vehicles strategically placed to respond within seconds of any mishap. The scene looked ominous to casual observers, but to professionals, it represented the culmination of careful preparation and training. Harrison monitored the approach through binoculars, calling out position reports to supplement the tower's radar guidance. Elena, he's lined up perfectly. Whatever you're doing, it's working. His compliment was genuine, guiding an inexperienced pilot through an emergency landing required not just technical knowledge but an understanding of human psychology under stress. 1 mile out, Razor 7. This is the easy part now, just keep doing exactly what you've been doing. Your runway is clear, emergency equipment is standing by as a precaution, and you have a clear approach all the way to touchdown. Vega's voice remained steady, projecting confidence she might not have entirely felt but knowing the pilot needed to hear certainty rather than doubt. The Lightning crossed the runway threshold at exactly the speed and altitude Vega had specified, its landing gear locked down despite the hydraulic failure, its approach angle textbook perfect despite the challenging circumstances. For a moment, it seemed the emergency would conclude with nothing more dramatic than a routine landing performed under unusual conditions. Then, just as the aircraft was about to touch down, a violent crosswind gust caught the Lightning's vertical tail surfaces, pushing the nose slightly off the runway centerline and threatening to turn a successful emergency landing into a disaster. "Power Razor 7, give me power now." Vega's command cracked like a whip through the radio, her calm demeanor abandoned for the sharp authority needed in moments of crisis. "Don't try to correct with rudder, use power to stabilize, then ease back to landing configuration." The recruits watching from the mess hall windows held their collective breath as the aircraft wavered momentarily between control and catastrophe. In that instant, they understood with crystalline clarity the weight of responsibility the woman they'd mocked was carrying. One wrong instruction, one moment of hesitation or poor judgment, and a fellow airman would pay the price for their failure. But Vega's guidance proved sound. The Lightning's pilot applied power smoothly, stabilized his approach, then reduced thrust as the aircraft settled onto the runway with a firm but controlled touchdown. The landing wasn't graceful, but it was safe, and in emergency aviation, safe was beautiful. "Outstanding work, Razor 7. Vega's voice carried genuine warmth and relief. "Welcome back to Earth. Taxi clear of the active runway when you're able, and congratulations on handling your first emergency like a professional." Her praise was well earned. The pilot had maintained composure under pressure and followed instructions precisely, demonstrating the discipline his training had instilled despite his limited experience. As the Lightning taxied toward the emergency vehicles with its pilot safe and unharmed, a profound silence settled over the communications center. The crisis had passed, another potential tragedy averted through the combination of training, experience, and professional competence. Vega removed her headset slowly, her hands steady despite the adrenaline that had sustained her through the emergency. "Nice work, Alina," Harrison said quietly, his words carrying the weight of professional respect and personal gratitude. "That kid owes you his career, possibly his life." His assessment wasn't hyperbole. Emergency landings with dual hydraulic failure had claimed experienced pilots before, and a rookie facing such circumstances alone might not have survived the experience. Vega nodded acknowledge, not sign meant, but seemed suddenly drained, the energy that had sustained her through the crisis now ebbing away like a tide. "He did the hard part," she replied modestly. "I just provided information. Good pilot, he listened, followed instructions, didn't panic. That's what made the difference." Her deflection of credit was characteristic, but those who'd witnessed her performance understood the critical role her expertise had played. The communications center gradually returned to its normal rhythm as personnel resumed their regular duties. Emergency vehicles began standing down from high alert status, their crews conducting post-incident procedures with the methodical thoroughness that military operations demanded. The crisis had lasted less than 30 minutes from first alert to successful resolution, but its impact would ripple through the base for considerably longer. Back in the mess hall, the 5 recruits finally found the courage to leave their table, their earlier appetite completely forgotten. They moved with the subdued manner of individuals who'd witnessed something that fundamentally changed their understanding of the world around them. The casual arrogance of youth had been replaced by a more mature appreciation for the complexity and seriousness of military aviation. Rodriguez stopped near the window, staring at the distant figure of the F-35 Lightning as it was surrounded by emergency crews conducting post-landing inspections. The aircraft that had been moments away from potential disaster now sat safely on the ground, testament to the skill of its pilot and the guidance of someone the recruits had dismissed as irrelevant. "We really screwed up," Mitchell said quietly, his words carrying the weight of dawning maturity. I mean, really, really screwed up. His assessment was accurate if understated. Their behavior had been not just rude but profoundly disrespectful to someone whose service and expertise demanded better treatment. Thompson nodded agreement, his usual cocky demeanor completely absent. She probably saved that pilot's life, and we were sitting here making jokes about her. The irony was inescapable. While they'd been demonstrating their ignorance and immaturity, she'd been preparing to use her knowledge and experience in service of others, just as she'd done throughout her military career. As Colonel Vega finally emerged from the communications center, her civilian clothes now seeming like a disguise that failed to conceal her true nature, the recruits faced a decision. They could slink away, hopping to avoid confrontation with someone they'd wronged, or they could attempt to make amends for behavior that had been inexcusable regardless of their ignorance of her identity and achievements. The choice would define not just how they handled this particular situation, but what kind of military personnel and human beings they would become as they progressed through their careers. Character, as their instructors had repeatedly emphasized, was revealed not in moments of comfort and ease, but in how individuals responded when confronted with their own failures and shortcomings. Vega walked through the corridors of Nellie's with the measured pace of someone no longer driven by the urgent demands of active duty, yet still carrying herself with the bearing that had defined decades of military service. The successful resolution of the F-35 emergency had drained more energy than she cared to admit, serving as a stark reminder of the physical and emotional toll such situations extracted even from experienced personnel. As she approached the main exit, the afternoon sun streaming through glass doors painted golden rectangles across the polished floors. She became aware of footsteps behind her. The gait was hesitant, uncertain, not the confident stride of military personnel comfortable with their environment and role. She paused near a display case containing historical aviation photographs, using the reflection in the glass to identify her followers without the confrontational act of turning around. 5 young faces stared back at her from the reflection, their expressions carrying a mixture of shame and determination that she recognized from decades of mentoring junior officers through difficult lessons. These were the recruits from the mess hall, the ones whose cruel amusement had been so obvious, whose mockery had been so thoughtlessly delivered. Now they stood behind her like schoolchildren summoned to the principal's office, uncertain how to proceed, but knowing they needed to proceed nonetheless. Rodriguez cleared his throat softly, the sound barely audible in the quiet corridor. "Ma'am," his voice cracked slightly, betraying nerves that military training hadn't yet fully disciplined. Could we speak with you for a moment?" Vega turned slowly, her pale blue eyes studying the 5 young faces with the same analytical intensity she'd once applied to instrument readings and tactical situations. She saw guilt there, and embarrassment, but also something more promising, the beginning of wisdom that came from recognizing one's own limitations and failures. "Of course," she replied simply, her tone neutral and professional. She wouldn't make this easy for them, but neither would she make it unnecessarily difficult. Some lessons required students to struggle through the learning process themselves, to find their own words for concepts that couldn't be effectively transmitted through lecture or punishment. Mitchell stepped forward slightly, assuming the role of spokesman through some unspoken agreement among his companions. "Ma'am, we owe you an apology. What we did in the mess hall was—" He struggled for words adequate to express regret for behavior that had seemed amusing at the time but now felt monumentally inappropriate. "What you did was human," Vega interrupted gently, surprising them with her understanding rather than condemnation. "Young, thoughtless, and cruel, but human. The question isn't whether you made a mistake, because obviously you did. The question is what you learned from it." Her response wasn't what they'd expected. They'd prepared for anger, for righteous indignation, for the kind of tongue-lashing that their drill instructors had perfected. Instead, They found themselves facing something more challenging, disappointment tempered by the possibility of redemption. Thompson found his voice, his words tumbling out in a rush of confession and contrition. "We didn't know who you were, ma'am. We thought you were just some civilian who'd gotten lost on base. We had no idea you were a colonel, or that you just saved someone's life, or—" He trailed off, realizing that his explanation was actually making things worse rather than better. "And if I had been just some civilian who'd gotten lost," Vega asked quietly, "would that have justified your behavior? Does someone need to wear stars or ribbons to deserve basic courtesy and respect?" Her questions cut to the heart of the matter, challenging not just their actions, but the underlying attitudes that had made such actions possible. The silence stretched uncomfortably as the recruits grappled with implications they hadn't considered. Their mockery hadn't been based on military rank or demonstrated incompetence. It had been based on appearance, on age, on assumptions about worth and value that had no basis in anything meaningful or admirable. Airman Chen, who had been quiet throughout the confrontation, finally spoke up. "No, ma'am, it wouldn't have justified anything. We were wrong, period. Not wrong because we didn't know your rank, but wrong because we were being—" He searched for the right word, then settled on honesty. "We were being assholes, ma'am. There's no excuse for it." Vega nodded slowly, appreciating the brutal honesty if not the language. "Better," she said simply. "Much better. At least now you're being honest about what happened instead of trying to minimize it or explain it away." Her acknowledgement of their improved response carried the faint suggestion that redemption might be possible, that this conversation could end somewhere better than it had begun. "Ma'am," Rodriguez interjected, "is there anything we can do to make this right? Any way we can?" He gestured helplessly, uncertain how one apologized for mocking someone who had just demonstrated the kind of competence and dedication they could only aspire to achieve. "You can remember this feeling," Vega replied without hesitation. "Right now, you're embarrassed and ashamed, and you should be. But more importantly, you're learning something about the danger of assumptions, about the value of treating people with dignity regardless of how they look or where you think they belong." She paused, studying their faces. "If you remember this lesson and apply it to future encounters with people you don't immediately understand, then something good will have come from today's mistake." The recruits nodded earnestly, recognizing